Okay, the title, Saint Alphonsus Liguori, a saint for the impious. Like, this is how impious people imagine a saint would be like Alphonsus. Pious people, not so much, but this is the impious person's idea of a saint, is Saint Alphonsus Liguori. Saint Alphonsus Liguori, 1696 to 1787. So he's an 18th century saint, largely. There he is. And this is the first part. I think there are 5 parts, and this is part 1, introduction. And I'm going to give the central idea. Okay? The central idea. John the 23rd, oh, Saint Alphonsus, what glory and what an object of study for the clergy of Italy. We have been familiar with his life and his works ever since the first year of our priestly formation. Reading the works of St. Alphonsus Liguori, it formed whole generations of priests, including the priests of the Vatican Council. A very important spiritual formation in reading his writings. John Paul II, he spoke to the simple in such a way that everyone could understand. That is a basic theme of my talk, that he was a great theologian who spoke to the simple in such a way that everyone could understand. That's the heart of his sanctity, was being a genius who could communicate with simple people. So, 2 examples of his ability to communicate in a simple way. He wrote meditations for the Stations of the Cross, which were much read, much studied for generations, still to this day. So very much focused on the Stations of the Cross. And secondly, he wrote the legendary Italian Christmas carol, Tu scendi dalle stelle. You came down from the stars. I'm going to stop struggling with this and use the space bar. Okay, so we're going to listen to it. And there are the words on the screen with it.
Cielo, e vieni in una gran
Okay, it's not going to stop unless I try to... Oh no, it started again. Okay. So I just want to look at the words of his hymn. From starry skies descending, thou comest, glorious King. A manger low thy bed, in winter's icy sting. O my dearest child, most holy, shuddering, trembling in the cold. Great God, thou lovest me, what suffering thou didst bear, that I near thee might be. Thou art the world's creator, God's own and true word. Yet here no robe nor fire, for thee, divine Lord. Dearest, fairest, sweetest infant, dire the state of poverty. The more I care for thee, since thou, O divine love, wilt now so poor to be. And as this is the center, he managed to get, his whole theology is in this hymn. It's about God's intense love for us and the way God took on poverty for us. That's the whole of Alphonsus' theology in this Christmas carol. So, John Paul II said, St. Alphonsus was a close friend of the people of the poor sections of the main city of the Kingdom of Naples, a friend of the workers, and above all of the people of the countryside. This feeling for people characterized the whole life of the saint as missionary, founder, bishop, and writer. So he gave himself to the people, for the people, because of his intense feeling of the love of God for us in the incarnation. So we ask, how could he be both a teacher of spiritual life for all, especially the simple, and a person of vast theological culture? That is the question, because most people of vast theological culture find it impossible to communicate with simple people. And yet, he did not. He was, why? Because his spirituality is centered on Christ and on his gospel. And it's not about isms, it's not about theories, it's not about ideas, it's about a person. Meditation on the mystery of the incarnation and on the Lord's passion were often the subject of his preaching. Redemption is offered to all human beings in abundance. And that is the heart of all his thinking, his whole life, his whole spirituality puts Christ at the center. And that's why he found it so easy to communicate and to spend his life with simple people. So now I go to my second part, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about his life. First of all, as we know, he was born in 1696. He was the scion of a noble Neapolitan family, and he studied law. He graduated as a lawyer at the age of 16 and went off to be a lawyer. And then at the age of 27, he decided to be a priest and was ordained at the age of 30, just a few years later. So his family tried to stop him leaving off the law. And so he writes all in his books about how you just got to leave your family, fight them, and do what God wants you to do. So he immediately gave himself to an intense apostolate in the poorer areas of Naples. And you think if John Paul thought it was intense, it probably was very intense. And I thought most people probably don't know where Naples is, so I put it on the map there. You can see it's down in the south of Italy. In the south is the poor part of Italy. The north is the rich part, and the south is the very, very poor part where the mafia came from. And so, he gave himself to the poorest area of the poorest part of Italy, and that's where he lived and worked for the rest of his life. And so he worked as a catechist in the humblest classes of Neapolitan society, to whom he liked preaching and whom he instructed in the basic truths of the faith. He patiently taught them to pray. So the first thing he did amongst the poor was to teach them to pray. That was the most important, as he saw, the most important part of his vocation to the poor was teaching them to pray. And he created the evening chapels in the most wretched districts. The evening chapels were little clubs, little groups of people who met in the evening after work to pray and meditate on Scripture. And he soon had them all organized in groups where they prayed every evening. And at first they were meeting in houses and praying, and then the bishop said, don't like this, so they started meeting in churches, and they became known as the evening chapels, where they would meet. These humble and poor people met every evening to pray. And he had all his followers getting people to come together and pray in the evenings. And so Benedict XVI said the evening chapels appear as a model of missionary activity from which we may draw inspiration today too for a new evangelization, particularly of the poorest people, and for building a more just and supportive coexistence. So the idea is, this is how we could re-evangelize our society, would be to recreate something like evening chapels for poor people. That's Benedict's suggestion. Then in 1732, Alphonsus created the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. He created a religious order in order to carry out this work. So it was for the evangelization of the poor that he founded the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer. For 30 years, this missionary apostolate took Alphonsus in many directions, deepening in him the choice of the poor and the humble. So the point of the Redemptorist order was to work amongst the poor and the humble, especially teaching them to pray, to be close to Jesus, and to come together and pray in groups in their evening chapels. That was the point of the Redemptorist mission. So in 1762, he was made Bishop of Sant Agata de Gotti. In 1775, he had to give up because he had terrible arthritis, and he was in so much pain he couldn't continue as bishop. So in fact, if you have arthritis, you can make a novena to St. Alphonsus. He's the patron of people with arthritis. And finally, after many years in extreme pain, extreme agony from the arthritis, he died at the age of 91 in 1787. And on being told that he had died, Pope Pius VI said he was a saint. It was obvious that he was a living saint to his contemporaries. So the Pope immediately pronounced that he was a saint. He wasn't canonized for a while, but it was evident that he was a saint at the point of death. So I'm now going to my third part, which was Alphonsus as a moral theologian. This is what he's famous for, is being a moral theologian. So he carried out a renewal of moral theology, which was not based on just thinking about ethics. His whole renewal of moral theology was based on his encounters in the confessional. He was meeting people in the confessional who didn't know what to do, because on the one hand, they were terrified of God, and on the other hand, they didn't know how to follow the moral law. So he met people in the confessional, and he wanted to carry out what he himself called a ministry of grace and forgiveness, and yet what he found was that people were too frightened to be able to even think about how to be moral. Because at the time, moral theology was divided between two extremes. On the one hand, there were followers of Jansenism, and the Jansenists essentially said, it's impossible to carry out the moral law, but don't worry, because everything is grace. So on the one hand, you have Jansenists who said the moral law is extremely difficult, but don't worry, because it's all grace anyway. And on the other hand, you have just rigorists who have a list of laws which are just impossible to carry out. And so Alphonsus is meeting these people in the confessional who are torn between rigorism and Jansenism and don't know how to actually be moral in everyday life. And so what he tries to do is mediate between rigorism and Jansenism. Those who say everything is grace and those who say everything is law. And he's trying to mediate between everything is law and everything is grace. Two kind of theories. And both of those things are just theories. And so the way he mediated between everything is law and everything is grace was by saying, talk to Jesus. The answer to how to balance everything is law and everything is grace is actually get into conversation with God. So There were Jansenists who were strict, who fomented fear and presented a grim and severe face of God, very different from the face revealed to us by Jesus. St. Alphonsus proposed a balanced synthesis of the requirements of God's law, fully revealed by Christ and interpreted authoritatively by the Church. And his balance was based on one simple idea, which is you'll find out what to do in prayer. Figure out what to do in prayer. Prayer will tell you how to mediate between grace and law. So, how does he mediate between rigorism and Jansenism? He who prays is saved. Simple statement, he who prays is saved. If you're terrified about your salvation, simply pray. And if you know you're praying, you know you are saved. If you're not praying, you should worry. But if you're praying, then you're in contact with God, and this is your salvation. Your salvation, you know you are saved, and you don't have to fear that you're not saved if you know that you're talking to God. So he who prays is saved. Know also that you will probably gain more by praying 15 minutes before the Blessed Sacrament than by all the other spiritual exercises of the day. So he's famous, legendary, for simply telling people to pray and to pray before the Blessed Sacrament. God does not, this is Alphonsus speaking, God does not deny anyone the grace of prayer, with which one obtains help to overcome every form of concupiscence and every temptation. And I say, and I will always repeat as long as I live, that the whole of salvation lies in prayer. The whole of salvation lies in prayer. So if you ask for God's help to overcome any kind of temptation and you sincerely pray to God for help, he will help you and you'll be given the grace to do if you pray. That's his answer. And this is also Alphonsus speaking. Just as laxity in the hearing of confessions leads to the ruin of souls, so also does rigorism do great harm to them. I disapprove of certain kinds of rigorism which bring destruction and not edification. Charity and gentleness are needed with this, sinners. This was a characteristic of Jesus Christ. And if we want to bring souls to God and save them, we must imitate not Jansenius, but Jesus Christ, who is the example of all missionaries. Certainly amongst all devotions, after that of receiving the sacraments, that of adoring Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament takes the first place, is the most pleasing to God and the most useful to ourselves. Oh, what a beautiful delight to be before an altar with faith, to represent our wants to him as a friend does to a friend in whom he places all his trust. Befriend Jesus, and he will befriend you, and he will enable you to carry out the works of the law. So, part 4, the center of Alphonsus' teaching is love, and the love of God for us in Jesus Christ. Okay, so his most famous book about this is called The Practice of Loving Jesus Christ. So I'm going to read to you from that book. The whole sanctity and perfection of a soul consists in loving Jesus Christ, our God, our sovereign good, and our Redeemer. The whole of sanctity is loving Jesus. That's what the whole of theology consists in, is simply loving Jesus, our God, and our Redeemer. But it begins from the love of Jesus for us. He could very well have saved us without dying and without suffering at all. But no, he chose a life of sorrow and contempt, and a death of bitterness and ignominy, even to the expiring on a cross, the gibbet of infamy. He humbled himself, becoming obedient unto death, even to the death of the cross. But why, if he could have ransomed us without suffering, why should he choose to die, and to die on a cross? To show us how he loved us. He loved us, and because he loved us, he delivered himself up to sorrows and disgraces, and to a death more cruel than even any man endured in this world. This is what Alphonsus loved to meditate upon. He loved to meditate on this. This is why he wrote the Stations of the Cross. The whole force of his meditation is on how much Jesus loved us even unto death. So that's why you see all those pictures of Alphonsus meditating on a cross, because this is what he wanted us to meditate on, to think about the love of God for us. And in response, our love for Jesus. Who can deny that of all devotions, devotion to the passion of Jesus Christ is the most useful, the most tender, the most agreeable to God, the one that gives the greatest consolation to sinners, and most powerfully enkindles loving souls? Whence is that we receive so many blessings, if it is not from the passion of Jesus Christ? Whence have we hope of pardon, courage against temptation, confidence that we shall go to heaven? So, of all devotions, devotion to the passion. It was devotion to the passion that made Alphonsus a great saint. And then Jesus' love for us. The love of Jesus Christ toward men in him created a longing desire for the moment of his death, when his love could be most fully manifested to them. And oh, with what desire does Jesus Christ want to come into our souls in the Holy Communion? With desire I have desired to eat this passion with you before I suffer. So he spoke on that night in which he instituted the sacrament of love. And in order that everyone might easily receive him, he desired to leave himself under the appearance of bread. For if he had left himself under the appearance of some rare or costly food, the poor would have been deprived of him. But no, Jesus would hide himself under the form of bread, which costs but little and can be found everywhere, in order that in every country might be able to find him and receive him. Now, this is what the infinite love of God for man has done, that he would permit men to possess him in the most intimate union by giving himself whole and entire under the appearance of bread in the sacrament. He stands there as though behind a wall, and from thence he beholds through a closed lattice. We do not see him, but he sees us, and is there really present. He is present in order that we may possess him, but he hides himself from us to make us desire him. He could not satisfy his love by giving himself to the human race by his incarnation and by his passion. But he desired to find a way whereby he might give himself entirely to each one of us in particular. And to this end he instituted the sacrament of the altar, in order to unite himself wholly to each. He who eats my flesh, he said, abides in me, and I in him. So Jesus personally comes to each one of us in the Eucharist, in the Blessed Sacrament. And he wanted to become bread so that he could personally unite himself with each one of us through that sacrament. And in response, our love. He who leaves off prayer will leave off loving Jesus Christ. Prayer is a blessed furnace in which the fire of the holy love is enkindled and kept alive. So this is how we love him. We love him in the Blessed Sacrament by praying before the Blessed Sacrament. And finally, part 5, the church, because he's an intensely ecclesial theologian. What I noticed in reading the practice of loving Jesus Christ is that he quotes every single page. He's quoting Bonaventure, Bernard of Siena, John of Chrysostom, Dionysius, Thomas Aquinas, Francis of Sales. He just quotes, like, every single page. His argument, his way of explaining any single thing is to tell you who said it. He just tells you this guy said it, and that person said it, and Teresa said it, and Bernard said it. And it's the whole thing. He's the most theological theologian since Thomas Aquinas, because he's completely steeped in the writings of the saints. And every single point he makes by referring to what one of the saints said. And so John Paul II said, the message of Alphonsus, even when he was innovative and above all then, derived from the centuries-old consciousness of the church. He had, as few others did, the sensus ecclesiae, the sense of the church, a criterion that remained with him in his theological research and pastoral practice in such a way that he became the voice of the church. So that is my presentation. That is the heart of his teaching. It's God's love for us, our love for God in prayer. And John Paul says that this is someone who is the voice of the church, because it's a really simple message, and yet it's the whole of Catholicism is there. in this one simple message. Thank you.